I'm sure you enjoyed that session. So, in this next step, we're going to be talking about how to identify and refine your research questions, particularly in a systematic review. So, remember to like, subscribe, and share. So, let's go.
Now, in our session today, we're going to talk about identifying and refining research questions. So it's going to be a very interesting session. We're going to talk about how to identify and refine your research question. Now, the first thing we need to start with here, we'll talk about what is a research question. Then we'll move on to talk about the importance of a clear research question. Then we'll now talk about the steps to identify a research question. Then we'll now elaborate or talk about how you can refine your research question, the criteria for refining your research questions. Then we'll take a look at detailed examples of refining a research question. And then we'll talk about the common mistakes in formulating a research question. So if you remember here, we'll be talking about how to identify and refine your research question. Now, it's actually a very interesting bulldog out there on research question. We actually really love using comical examples to explain. And we are just getting closer to where we'll have to start performing practicals using set out questions to show us examples of what we really need to do. Now, the picture you can actually see here is not something different from a question, because many a times in research, we have the need to address a lot of things, right? So let's say you just started your master's or your PhD, or you're an early career researcher, right? And at any point you have a lot of questions coming on your head, and this is just something as what you're seeing on this picture, right? So you can be asking the question, what causes literally everything, right? What causes everything? How does coffee drinking affect sleeping in teenagers? How does coffee intake affect teenagers? And anything, it could be anything in any field where you find yourself. So you could be in let's say maybe you're actually undertaking cancer research, right? So you want to understand what are the effects of chemotherapy on maybe female patients. How effective is the interventions for breast cancer and reducing breast cancer mortality. So every day of our life, literally, we come in contact with numerous research questions. We ask a lot of questions, literally. And those questions, for us to be able to undertake a proper systematic review research on them, it means that those questions has to be refined properly. And that is the basis of our lecture today. How can we be able to refine our questions? How can we be able to ask better questions in research, get to address much more detailed questions that's going to show suitability to be answered, particularly on the course of performing a systematic review. Now, remember that in our outline here, we have already detailed that we're going to be talking about what's a research question, the importance, and a clear research question. I'm also going to look at the steps to identify a research question, how to refine it, the criteria, examples, and common mistakes. Now, we come into the lecture properly here now to ask a question. What is a research question? Now, in simple terms, a research question is anything that is clear, focused question that guides a study or any investigation, right? For you to conduct any research, there should be something that guides it, that guides you in the whole entire process. And that's the question that you've come up with. Let's say you've asked the question, what will it take how many liters will it take you to drive from New York to Los Angeles? And that is the question. So it means that answering that question is going to guide you in determining how much liters you're going to put into your fuel, maybe your car gas tank that's going to drive you from New York to Los Angeles. And that is just how simple it is. How many cabin biscuits or how many cartons of Indomie is going to be very suitable for you from the first semester in university down till maybe your final year. So that's a question that you've asked, right? So it means that your question needs to be clear, it needs to be focused, and it needs to guide your entire investigation. So that means a question helps to identify what you're trying to learn or find out by specifying the topic, or maybe the population or subjects, or what aspect or relationship you're trying to explore. So while we go on in our daily lives, we encounter numerous questions, and these questions are very, very, very pertinent for us. It tries to guide how we want, it tries to predict how the outcomes of our research is going to be. It tries to predict what participants are we looking at, how do we want our research, our studies to be focused on. That is exactly why a research question is very, very important and imperative for you in a systematic review. And I could go further to say that a research question is just like a special question that you ask when you want to learn something new. So we want to know what is the prevalence of HIV and AIDS in Nigeria. So that's actually a very special question. So we really need to know what's new about it. So you can actually address a research question as the title of your study, because what your study title is going to explore is literally trying to know what is new about your study. So it also helps you to focus on what you want to find out, or just like a treasure map tells you where you want to look for the treasure. So it's like I said, you want to know how many liters is it going to take you to drive from Los Angeles to maybe New York or Texas or maybe Wyoming in the United States of America. So that is just what a research question is all about. So anytime you want to conduct any scientific investigation, it's usually very imperative for us to set out a clear question, a clear guideline that is going to help us to understand the type of participants we want to include. What exactly are we going to be looking at? So when on the course of this lecture, you see that when we're now looking at the steps in formulating a research question, that is where we will now start having a breakdown, a break-even approach on those areas that we need to explore in that subject to be able to know the particular type of relationship we want to explore in our question. So it's just like trying to solve a mystery, right? So the such question is just like the first clue that helps you to find out where you want to start looking for answers. So if you were asking what is the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in a certain setting in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So with that particular research question, it means that you have to start looking for your answers around sub-Saharan Africa first. So that's where you need to start going to. So you don't have to waste your time searching in the wrong places. You don't have to start saying you're looking for prevalence of type 2 diabetes in sub-Saharan Africa and you're roaming around in China. So a research question tries to make your investigation specific and focused. Now, this is also another important theoretical aspect that we really need to understand on the course of this training series, right? Now, we need to know what's the importance of a research question. Now, for you to develop your research question, right, the research question is very, very important because it tries to set the direction. It guides us. It provides a roadmap. It helps us to know where we want to start and what we want to focus on. And also, it tries to help us to do what? Save time and effort. By knowing that the research question is going to be, okay, you want to know the psychosocial determinants of smoking among youths in Africa, right? So it sets the direction to tell us that we are focusing on psychosocial determinants. We want to know what are the psychosocial determinants of cigarette smoking among youth in maybe Nigeria. Now, it now sets that roadmap, right? So it saves us the time and effort to start moving out from youth and not moving out from Nigeria. So it's more like it prevents collecting extra or unnecessary information or keeping the research focused on what matters most. So we are just interested in the psychosocial determinants of cigarette smoking. We are not going out of context. So that is just what it tries to do. And also it tries to ensure relevance. So a research question tries to do create that relevance. So it makes sure your study is meaningful and directly addresses a specific important issue or problem. Now the game begins here. Now, what are the steps to identify a research question? First of all, the first step here, right? We can choose a broad topic. For example, I could say cancer. I'm interested in cancer among women. So So it means that my area of interest here is what? Cancer. And that's my subject. So that's what I'm passionate about, and it's relevant to my what field. Maybe my field is what? Public health. Now the next thing I need to do now is to review existing literature and studies to understand what has been done, so that I can be able to do what? Identify gaps or unanswered research questions. We will also come to that, right? So for cancer among women, it's very broad, right? So we need to now start knowing areas. Is it cancer among women in Nigeria? Or should we focus it on cancer among women in the United States? Or should we focus it on maybe using another approach, another type of design and all that to address our questions, right? So this will now help us to come down to step 3, where we can now do what? Narrow down our topic, so that we can actually focus on a particular aspect of the broad topic based on the gaps we've identified from existing what? From reviewing existing literature or studies. And this is actually going to help us to actually know where we want to be interested in. Probably we might not say, okay, yes, instead of saying cigarette smoking among youth in Africa, we can now delimit our question to focus only on psychosocial determinants, and not just in Africa. Focus it down now on youths and now in Nigeria. So it makes our question more feasible and easy to answer. So I could actually use another example here. I could say maybe, for example, I could say HIV and AIDS in America. Now I could now say, since that is a broad subject, right? I could now say review literature and find out that there has been a lot of studies among HIV in America and all that, right? So for me to identify gaps now, I could now go through what? Maybe use my PICO framework, which we're also going to explain on the later course of this lecture, to now narrow it down. So I say, okay, let me focus it on youth, or let me focus it on what? Infants. HIV among infants in what? Maybe northern part of America, and that way I make my question more specific. So narrowing down your topic is very easy, very, very essential aspect in identifying what? A research what? Question. Now this is where the game starts now, continues. Now how do we now refine our research question? That's where our thoughts begins to come up. How can we be able to do what? Refine our research question. Now, for you to refine your research question, you need to make it specific, just as I explained, right? So you could decide to do what? Focus your research question on one clear issue instead of a broad topic. Now, so for example here, instead of asking what causes stress, we could ask, how does school workload affect stress levels in teenagers? Now, remember that the first component is what? To make it what? Specific. Now, we are not just asking questions about stress. We're not trying to bring in what? School workload. And how does it affect it? And now we're not narrowing it down to what? Teenagers. We're making it specific to what? Teenagers. Now, let's go in terms of feasibility here now. Now, remember, on the course of this training series, when we'll be formulating our research question, now, let's say, to make sure that your questions are feasible, you need to make sure you have the time, resources, and data when you've done what? Remember in this step, to when you've done what? Reviewed what? Existing what? Literature. So that is why you now need to come here and make sure what? You have enough what? Data. So you need to choose a question like, what is the impact of daily exercise on blood pressure in adults? So if you have access to adult participants and can measure their blood pressure, that would be a what? A great what? Feasible what? Research question. You can't come up with a research question on what is the impact of daily exercise on maybe dead patients, people that are dead. Now that could not really be a what? Feasible topic. I'm just giving an example now because you can't be able to get that data. So that is just like a very, very relatable type criteria for your what? For the feasibility of a research question. So your research question has to be very, very what? Feasible. Now another aspect, imperative aspect, is going to be what? The relevance. Now you need to ensure that your question matters to the field where you're conducting, and it adds useful knowledge, particularly that solves what? Problems. Like, you can imagine now, I could say, for example, now, what are the barriers to mental health services for college students? So that means it's actually very relevant for what? For psychology. So if you go back here now, you see that the very first step when we are identifying any research question is to make sure we choose a topic that is what? Relevant to our field. And if you remember here, I gave an example here that I could actually decide to choose what? type 2 diabetes, which is very relevant to my what? To my field as a what? Public health professional. Then I will now have to do my what? Review existing literature to make sure I'm able to do what? Get access to data, which is going to be what? Feasible. And then I'll now narrow it down so that it could be a more focused research question to my what? To my field. Now, one thing that is very special we're going to look at on the course of our lecture series today is what the criteria / framework for what refining our research question, because it's not enough for us to talk about making it conducting a preliminary draft and narrowing it down. We also need to understand how to do what? Refine it. And now, for you to refine your research question, there are some certain elements, key elements that you need to consider, frameworks you need to consider when you're refining your research question. The first one is what? The population. What is the what population are you interested in studying? Right. So you can actually when we also show some practicals, right? So we can actually look at this as what? A problem. Now, for example, let me have a text here on this, right? So I could actually put this here. I could say, okay, let me create a Microsoft. What is our correct sheet? Now, for example, here, I could start by saying, in terms of the population, now maybe probably I'm interested in what? Type 2 diabetes adults, right? So this could be my what? Population. Now, in terms of intervention, what intervention is being done? Maybe I could be interested in maybe metformin, which is a what? Which is a drug for managing type 2 diabetes, right? So now I could return back there. I could say, now in terms of your comparison, maybe if there's an alternative, I want to compare metformin with what? Other interventions. Or maybe I could say exercise. I'm trying to formulate my question, remember? Then we can say in terms of outcome, what am I measuring? Maybe I'm interested in, let's say, reduction in blood glucose level, for example, and it's going to be a randomized control trials. So it means that for me to be able to come up with my question, I need to make sure I screen them using what? A particular what? Criteria or what? Framework. So now I need to now be sure, can it be done? Is it novel? Is it compelling? Is it novel? Does it add to knowledge? Is it ethical? Is it morally acceptable? Is it what? Relevant? Because I cannot come out in terms of morally acceptable. I can't come and start talking about prevalence or maybe, let's say, facilitators for child pornography. Now, for example, now, in terms of morally acceptable, now this might not be what? It might not be what? Morally what? Acceptable. Right? So that is what we mean by what? Making sure there is a what? There is a criteria. Is it feasible? Is it something you can be able to conduct using what we call the SMART criteria? Usually we always talk about the SMART criteria here, in our research question where we talk about the SMART. It has to be specific, it has to be measurable, it has to be achievable, it has to be realistic, it has to be what? Time bound. So this is what we call the what? SMART criteria. So it's also another criteria that you might want to actually use to what? Make sure you refine your what? Research question. So it's now for me that we can now be able to come up with a research question that we can say, what is the effectiveness of metformin in comparison this way now, right? We have now formulated our what? We have now formulated our what? Our what? Research question. And we are what? Good to go. So this is exactly what we are trying to do, what we are trying to explain. So, and that is how and now we now need to make sure that, yeah, do we have studies on this? Are there available studies? And we have our research question formatted. So I could do another example. Could say, okay, maybe the broad topic I have is what? HIV, and I'll say, okay, good. Now I could say, okay, maybe I want to use the criteria here and I want to formulate it, my topic, or I want to I'm not really explaining formulation of research question here. I'm just talking about how to refine your research question, right? So I could say infant population, and I could say maybe I could look at something, right? So this is what we call a heart, right? So I could now go ahead to talk about maybe compared to placebo, then I can now say quality of life. Now I've come up with some criteria, right, with the framework that I want to use to do what, to refine my research question, which is this. Now I could now go ahead to say, okay, fine. So I'm interested in what is the, I could, rather than using the what, I could say how effective is. I could take this. So we can see this. How effective is highly active antiretroviral therapy compared to placebo in improving beautiful, good. So this is what another question. So we're not really delving into formulating a research question because we're going to formulate so many of them. We have to formulate so many of them, right? But what we are talking about in this particular session is the criteria and framework for refining our research question. So it means that at this stage, probably you have something in mind. Maybe you have anything in mind. Maybe let's put, for example, you have cigarette. You want to do a review on cigarettes. Smoking, and that's where you have interest in, right? So from cigarette smoking, you could say, could bring in variables like prevalence of cigarette. Now you're refining it among youths. Remember, by refining it here, we start bringing in what? Population, and it could change when I'm going to show us our various models we use and refine a formulated research question. We'll still get to understand this better, but this is just like a tip of the iceberg. So cigarette smoke among youth in Nigeria, right? So because we can also use this as young adults in Nigeria. Okay, good. So that's it. Thank you. So we move on. Now, so you also remember that we need to make sure it's feasible, it's interesting, it's novel, because most times as a PhD student, you might find it very difficult to actually pick up on any research, because if it's not novel, your supervisor might find it very difficult to get that approved, and it has to be interesting, it has to be something that's trending, it has to be morally acceptable, and it just has to be relevant. Okay? Now, so here we're going to look at some examples, just like as I've mentioned in this series, and what are the effects of exercise. So now a refined question now is, how does irregular aerobic exercise impact the mental health of adults aged 30 to 50 with moderate depression? Now you see that this is not just a broad question, it is now well detailed. Now here is another example. How does diet affect health? Now here, we now refine it by saying, what is the effect of a low sugar diet on, now it's not just diet now. If you hover around here and you see that this is diet, low sugar diet, now specific. Just like we talked about exercise here, it's now aerobic exercise. On the blood glucose level. So all this here is health. Everything here is health over a 6-month period. So you need to make your systematic research question well refined. It's very, very imperative. It's very, very pertinent because it helps you to. Because on the course of your screening, when we start that extraction screening and all that, right? It is very, very important and very paramount for you to have a well-researched, a well-refined question so that you can be able to do what? Can be able to have a much more better implication on the course of your research. So yeah, we could actually look at the third example here. What improves students' learning? Now we're now saying, how does the use of interactive digital tools, now we're now specific, in classrooms improve the math test scores? We're not just talking about student learning or math test scores of middle school students in urban areas. So all these settings here, you can actually change them to locations, and that way you get to have a much more better refined question. So remember that it's not just about formulating any research question and tackling it, but the idea is for you to know how to start from the basics to refine a research question and also have a much more better outcome. So now the question now is what are some of the common mistakes in formulating research questions? Now, one of the common mistakes we have is that most times the research questions are too broad. So it's just like the opposite of all the things that we've actually explained here, right? So it's too broad, right? So you have to avoid questions that are too general, like what causes mental illness. This is actually a very, very broad question, right? And it's too narrow. You don't limit yourself with overly specific. So in as much as you're making your research question specific, you just need to find the balance, right? It needs to be you can't ask a question like, what is the effect of a 5-minute walk on stress? So you see that when it's too narrow, you struggle with studies. You find it very difficult to find studies because on the course of our systematic review journey, it means that you should now know how to do what? You should know how to identify studies from diverse databases. And that means when you have a too narrow study, when you have a too narrow title, it becomes very, very, very difficult for you to do it becomes very difficult for you to find studies. So that's a very common mistake we make in formulating research question. And also it's unfocused. So you make sure your question is not too vague, like, is exercise good? That's a very crazy question actually out there, because most times people actually ask a lot of questions that are actually very, very broad. Every day, like I told when we started this session, like every day we get a lot of questions, right? You see people asking so many questions. A lot of questions out there that are being asked, and along the line you find out that some of these questions are not well refined, just like we talked about, right? So your questions needs to be well refined. It needs to be well refined in the sense that it's not vague and not making a lot of sense. So we actually, after this, we're going to move to some couple of practice exercises, in knowing how to do refine some of your questions. So I've set out some couple of exercises for you people before we move on to our next meeting, which is going to be the models for formulating your research question. Where we'll now have to start our practicals. We've got questions, several models we will need to be using. We'll look at the PICO, the PEO, Spider, and a lot of them. We're also going to show some examples for your systematic review, particularly if you start your systematic review journey, in refining your research question. So I'm going to just have a rundown of what I just talked about tonight before we call it a night. So first of all, I talked about what is a research question. Where I explain that a research question is just all about knowing. Ask a research question, just any question, right? Any question that guides us from the very beginning to the end of any scientific investigation. That's just what it is, right? Because for you to start any scientific investigation, a research question is very pertinent because it's going to help you arrive at your destination. And also we talked about the importance of a clear research question, why it's very imperative. Because if we don't know the importance of a research question, then it's going to be very difficult for us to ask that question. And also we looked at some of the steps in identifying a research question? What are the actual steps we really need to do? We need to know. How can we refine our research question? How can actually have a more refined question? Making sure that we are coming from our own field, right? You have your own field. There are a lot of being on one field out there. Every day, lots of researchers are formulating diverse questions, trying to address a lot of health problems and health issues, people getting grants and all that. So it's very impressive that for you to get those grants, you need to actually ask a very detailed and refined question. And then also we looked at the criteria for refining your research question. What could be the criteria, for you to refine your research question, and what are the examples? And then we now looked at the what common mistakes. So we had a very clear look about the research question where we said that it's just like the special question that you ask when you want to really learn something new. So there are diverse questions we ask to make sure we uncover new insights in any stage, right? So it's just all about solving a mystery, trying to know what is not known. And then we also said that for you to have a clear research question, some of the importance is that it tries to set the direction. When we don't have a research question, we don't really know where we are heading to in our research. But the research question tries to let us know that we are going to conduct this research in Africa. This research is going to be focused on infants. This research is going to be focused on a certain type of population. And so it gives us that roadmap that we need. And it also helps us save time and effort, because when we now have that clear-cut direction, it saves us our time and our efforts. And it also makes sure that our research has relevance, because when you have a clear question that you're asking, it means that it's very specific, and there is something relevant that you're seeking to address. I'll just give a short example here of how we can actually move a broad question down to a narrow question, where I used type 2 diabetes and HIV and AIDS, and also cigarette smoking, where I said that the steps for you to identify a research question starts from becoming broad, something broad in your area. Because most times when you ask a PhD student, what do you want to study? Some of them could say, I want an information on malaria. I want to do my PhD on malaria. So that means it's broad. So talking about malaria is very broad. So you need to come up with some questions, right? And that means you need to start by reviewing existing literature, what has been done on malaria, what participants has this focused on, what type of intervention has been reviewed, and that is going to help you to now identify gaps. Gaps are areas that has not been addressed. There are unanswered questions that you can now narrow your research down to, right? So I'm going to also show us gap identification process, the practical steps in our future episodes. And we now say that for you to refine your research question, it has to be specific, right? So instead of you asking a broad question, you have to try and make it specific and detailed, and it needs to be very, very feasible, right? In the sense that it's something that you can actually get the data. And we looked at the SMART criteria, and relevance is also very, very important, right? So any question that you're going to be submitting, to me on this chat box, remember you have to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. You need to really make sure it's very, very relevant. It shows that particular relevance. And also, in terms of the criteria, you could actually use the more detailed framework. But when we're going to show the models, right, you can actually use any model in underpinning your research question, and a very clear-cut criteria, where it has to be feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. Then I also now give examples that for your starting point, right, you can actually say what are the effects of exercise. That's a very broad question. Now, but for you to refine it, which is narrowing it down, just as we discussed, you could actually go down to aerobic exercise. How does regular aerobic exercise impact the mental health of adults aged 30 to 50? So here now, there's a lot of things that are actually making it very specific, because you have a very well-detailed population group, have a well-detailed intervention group, and you also have a well-detailed outcome, depending on your model, which I'm also going to discuss in our future episode. And also, it also applies to this other question, answer the third question on how you can actually improve your student learning. And now we also made it very clear that some of the common mistakes in formulating research questions is that so many times PhD students have this problem, and students, researchers, clinicians out there who are actually trying to come up with a question has it to be so broad and it's too narrow, and maybe it could be unfocused. So you need to make sure the question is well focused, not so narrow, and not broad. So you just need to find the balance to make sure you have a question that is very feasible. And on the very course of the systematic review, you are able to come up with included studies and studies that are actually very relevant for you to answer your research question. So here are some exercises for us. I'm going to share this on the chat box. You have to turn this broad question, refine it to a specific question, and also you have also this where you have to using the PICOs that I've already explained here to fit in this topic. Try to create a population and intervention comparison outcome and study design. Then write down the complete questions here down for me. And also you have to now evaluate and improve a research question, right? Identify if this question is too broad, too narrow, or unfocused, then refine it to make it specific, feasible, and relevant. So I'm going to thank you guys very much for your time. Like and share and subscribe for watching this in the future. We're going to also be in our next meeting. We're going to be talking about the models for formulating your research question, and then we kick up with our detailed practical.